A frail elderly woman was thrown to the ground by police officers in a park, leaving the onlookers stunned. Amid a growing sense of injustice, an unexpected hero stepped forward, defying all odds to uphold justice. This courageous act not only changed the fate of the elderly woman but also inspired an entire community. Can a single act of bravery spark a greater movement for reform? Stay tuned. This story will leave you on the edge of your seat. If you love inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more meaningful content in the future. Mike Tyson, the boxing legend, often visited Lincoln Park every afternoon after his training sessions to savor its serene atmosphere. With a tumultuous past and a celebrated career, Mike had grown to cherish the tranquility of everyday life, moments when he could set aside the burdens of fame, find solace, and reconnect with his inner peace. That day, as he strolled along a shaded path, enjoying the rustling leaves, a commotion near a bench by the lake caught his attention. The sharp sound of raised voices made him stop. His piercing gaze turned toward the scene. 2 police officers, Miller and Thompson, were loudly berating an elderly woman huddled on the bench. The sight of her frail frame, stooped with age, struck a chord deep within him. As the elderly woman began to speak, one of the officers grabbed her arm and yanked it violently, causing her to lose her balance and collapse onto the ground. Mike's blood boiled. The vulnerability in her figure, her silver hair, and the fear in her eyes brought back memories of his own powerlessness in the past, times when he had been scorned because of his background and circumstances. He didn't know who she was, but the injustice unfolding before him was intolerable. The park's bystanders looked on, some pulling out their phones to record the incident, but no one dared to intervene. "I can't let this happen," he thought, his feet already carrying him toward the unfolding scene. The same eyes that once terrified opponents in the ring now gleamed with unyielding resolve. He paused a few steps away, studying the officer's movements, and then spoke with calm authority. "What are you doing? She's just sitting on a bench. Is this your version of justice?" The officers turned, their expressions hostile. Thompson, his tone cold and dismissive, snapped, "This is none of your business. Walk away if you don't want trouble." Mike drew a deep breath, his voice steady but firm. "This is no way to treat an elderly woman, especially when she's done nothing wrong. Release her immediately." Miller sneered, glancing at Thompson with mockery. "Look at him. Thinks he's some kind of hero." Thompson's eyes raked over Mike from head to toe, his tone dripping with disdain. "We're the law here. We don't need advice from outsiders. If you don't want a problem, you'd better leave." Mike clenched his fists but restrained his anger, knowing it wouldn't help the situation. Standing tall like an immovable force, his eyes locked on the officers with unwavering determination. A familiar thought echoed in his mind. If I don't step up, who will protect her? He took another step forward, positioning himself between the officers and the elderly woman. Leaning down slightly, he asked her gently, "Are you okay? What did they do to you?" The elderly woman, her face pale and hollow, her hands tightly cuffed, looked up at him with eyes that held a fragile mix of fear and hope. Before she could answer, Thompson interrupted, his tone sharp and threatening. "I told you to back off. You're interfering with police work." Mike straightened, his gaze steady as steel. "Interfering with what? You have no legitimate reason to arrest her. I won't stand by while you abuse your authority." Miller faltered for a moment, glancing nervously at the growing crowd around them. Phones were now out, recording every moment. Yet he tried to maintain his bravado. "Listen, big guy, this isn't your fight. Walk away or we'll make you." Mike stood firm, his voice low and commanding. "You don't scare me. I'm here to protect her and to stop you from doing something you'll regret." The crowd around them began to stir. Voices grew louder, some shouting, "Let her go! Stop abusing your power!" One officer moved to shove Mike aside, but he stood his ground, unmoved, his gaze cold and unrelenting, reminiscent of his days in the ring. Mike allowed a faint smile to cross his lips as he spoke, his tone razor-sharp. You should be afraid not of me, but of what your actions today will cost you. This will not just ruin your careers, it will erode whatever trust the public still has in law enforcement. The crowd erupted, demanding justice. A young woman raised her phone high and yelled, "They're abusing their power. Let her go now." Mike Tyson, with courage and resolve, remained steadfast, a shield of protection between the elderly woman and the injustice threatening to consume her. Miller and Thompson began to feel the weight of the situation as all eyes turned toward them. Thompson, still maintaining his rigid demeanor, barked loudly, "Step back! All of you are obstructing official police work. If you don't disperse immediately, we'll arrest you for causing a disturbance." The threats did nothing to quell the crowd. Instead, their outrage grew louder. An elderly woman in the crowd, her voice trembling but resolute, shouted, "We're not afraid of you. This isn't justice. This is abuse of power." Mike stood his ground, his unwavering gaze fixed on Thompson as he took another step forward. His voice rang with strength. "Release her now. Everyone here is watching. If you don't want this to ruin your careers, stop this madness immediately." Thompson glanced at Miller, his confusion evident, but Miller stubbornly held his stance and issued a firm order. "Get her in the car. We can't let them think we're weak." Thompson nodded and moved toward the elderly woman. But before he could act, Mike stepped quickly into his path, blocking the way. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices of support growing louder. At that moment, the wail of a police siren echoed through the park. A patrol car pulled up, and out stepped a middle-aged man with a stern expression. It was Lieutenant Taylor, Miller and Thompson's superior. He approached the scene, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Mike and the two officers. "What's going on here?" Taylor asked, his deep voice commanding attention. Miller turned to Taylor, his face betraying relief as he replied, "Sir, we were attempting to detain a suspect, but this man interfered and incited the crowd." Mike stepped forward, meeting Taylor's gaze directly. His tone was calm yet resolute. They weren't detaining a suspect, they were abusing their authority. This woman was sitting quietly on the bench, doing nothing wrong. Instead of investigating, they resorted to violence, slamming her to the ground and handcuffing her without cause. Taylor turned his attention to the elderly woman, who was still trembling, her eyes filled with fear. He looked back at Miller and Thompson, his expression hardening. "Do you have any reason to arrest her? Any evidence or reports?" Miller stammered. We thought she might be the suspect who fled this morning. We acted on instinct." Taylor raised an eyebrow, his tone cutting. "Instinct? Or were you simply targeting someone vulnerable? I want a full report right now." Neither officer could muster a response. Taylor turned to Mike, nodding slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Tyson, for stepping in. I'll handle this from here." He then issued a stern order. "Remove the handcuffs from her immediately and clear out. I'll deal with both of you later." Reluctantly, Miller unlocked the handcuffs while Thompson stepped back, his unease evident. The crowd erupted into cheers, with one voice shouting, "Mike Tyson is our hero." Mike showed no signs of elation. He knelt beside the elderly woman, gently helping her to her feet. "Are you all right? I'll make sure you're safe," he said softly. Tears streaming down her face, she nodded. Mike guided her to a bench away from the chaos, the cheers of the crowd echoing around them. As the noise subsided, Mike stepped forward, his eyes scanning the faces of those gathered. His voice was steady and powerful, carrying the gravitas of a champion. "Today, we witnessed something that should never happen, an abuse of power. An innocent woman who had done nothing wrong was harassed and brutalized by those who were supposed to protect her. If we weren't here, would this have stopped? Would justice have been served?" The crowd responded with shouts of agreement. A man's voice rang out, "We see this happen all the time, but no one ever speaks up." Mike nodded, his gaze unwavering. "That's why I couldn't stay silent. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but it must be the last time we allow it to happen without action. I don't know this woman, but I know she didn't deserve this. And I know it's our responsibility to stand up for what's right." Taylor stepped forward, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. His voice carried the weight of authority. "I understand your anger. As a police officer, I, too, am ashamed to witness the actions of my colleagues today. What happened here does not reflect the values of our force. I promise to conduct a thorough investigation and take appropriate action." Mike turned to Taylor, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Promises are good, but action is better. I hope you'll do what's right, not just addressing these two, but examining the entire system that allowed this to happen." Taylor paused for a moment before nodding. "You're right. I'll personally oversee this investigation. Abuse of power will not be tolerated." Mike faced the crowd again, his voice calm yet commanding, the voice of a leader. "We can't let incidents like this continue. Police officers aren't our enemies, but those who abuse their power within the system must be held accountable. Today we stood together. Let's keep this unity, not just to protect the vulnerable, but to ensure no one has to live in fear." Applause rippled through the park. A young woman raised her phone high, shouting, "Mike Tyson isn't just a boxing legend. He's a hero of justice." Mike turned back to the elderly woman, helping her to her feet. Though still trembling, her eyes now carried a glimmer of relief. She looked at Mike, her voice hoarse. "Thank you, young man. I don't know what would have happened without you." Mike smiled gently, his deep voice filled with warmth. "No thanks needed, ma'am. This is what anyone should do." Slowly, he guided her out of the park, the cheers of the crowd following them. He knew that what he had done today was just a small step, but it had planted a seed of hope in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Mike understood that change begins with acts of courage, the choice to refuse silence in the face of injustice. As Mike Tyson left the park with the elderly woman, the incident quickly spread across social media, thanks to videos captured by bystanders. Within hours, the footage of the two officers' abuse of power and Mike Tyson's bold stand for justice became the center of attention. The public outcry forced the Riverdale Police Department to take immediate action. Lieutenant Taylor decided to suspend Officers Miller and Thompson pending an investigation. An independent task force from the U.S. Justice Bureau was formed to conduct a thorough review of the officers' actions and identify systemic shortcomings within the department. Investigators swiftly gathered evidence, including videos from witnesses, testimonies from Mike Tyson and the elderly woman, identified as Evelyn Thompson, and past misconduct complaints against Miller and Thompson. The videos showed Evelyn sitting quietly on the bench, with no suspicious behavior, while the officers unnecessarily used force, throwing her to the ground and handcuffing her brutally. Evelyn's testimony and Mike's account further substantiated the allegations of cruelty and disregard for the law. The investigation also revealed a troubling pattern. Miller and Thompson had faced multiple complaints of misconduct in the past, most of which had been ignored or dismissed with minimal scrutiny. Outside the police station, small protests began to emerge. Protesters held signs demanding justice and reform under the banner of the Justice Reform Initiative. The media provided extensive coverage of the incident, and Mike Tyson quickly became a symbol for the voiceless. In a heartfelt interview, he stated, "Those without a voice deserve protection, not intimidation." His words struck a chord with the public, drawing the attention of human rights organizations and forcing the Riverdale Police Department to respond transparently and provide satisfactory answers. Miller and Thompson were summoned to an internal disciplinary hearing. Miller attempted to justify their actions, claiming they were merely doing their duty and acting swiftly to ensure public safety. However, video evidence from the scene entirely discredited his explanation. The Internal Review Board highlighted that the officers had no concrete evidence connecting Evelyn to any wrongdoing and had blatantly disregarded basic investigative protocols. Thompson, on the other hand, sought forgiveness, pleading for leniency. But Lieutenant Taylor was resolute, stating, "Chances have been given time and again, but you have destroyed the public's trust in this department." Ultimately, the Internal Review Board decided to terminate both Miller and Thompson for abuse of power and severe ethical violations. Their records were forwarded to the Department of Justice for potential criminal charges related to unlawful use of force and human rights violations. The verdict was made public, and the Riverdale Police Department pledged to enact reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. When asked about the outcome, Mike Tyson remarked, "This is a step in the right direction. I hope it sends a strong message that the era of silence is over." The park incident and Mike Tyson's courageous intervention became a catalyst for systemic change within law enforcement. Under public pressure and Lieutenant Taylor's commitment to reform, the Riverdale Police Department initiated a comprehensive renewal plan to rebuild community trust. Taylor announced that all officers would undergo mandatory training on professional ethics, cultural awareness, and nonviolent crisis management. These sessions emphasized that the role of the police is not to impose authority but to protect and serve the community. A new anonymous complaint system was also established, allowing citizens to report abuse of power without fear of retaliation. All complaints would be independently reviewed and investigated by an external committee to ensure transparency. Officers were also encouraged to report misconduct among their peers without the fear of retribution. Although not part of law enforcement, Mike Tyson became a passionate advocate for these reform efforts. He regularly participated in neighborhood town halls, sharing his story, and encouraging others to continue the fight for justice. In one such speech, he addressed the crowd, "Today, we witnessed something that should never happen, an abuse of power. An elderly woman, who did nothing wrong, was harassed and brutalized by those who were supposed to protect her. If we hadn't been there, would it have stopped? Would justice have been served?" The crowd responded with cheers of agreement. One man shouted, "We see this all the time, but no one dares to speak up." Mike nodded, his determined gaze sweeping over the audience. "That's why I couldn't stay silent. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but it must be the last time we let it happen without action. I don't know this woman, but I know she didn't deserve to be treated like that. And I know it's our duty to stand up for what's right." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. A young woman raised her phone high, shouting, "Mike Tyson isn't just a boxing legend. He's a hero of justice." Mike smiled but remained composed, knowing the road to change was long. For him, fighting for justice wasn't just the responsibility of one individual but a collective mission for the entire community. Justice is not just the responsibility of one individual. It is a duty shared by the entire community. As Mike Tyson left the park with the elderly woman, Lieutenant Taylor turned to Miller and Thompson, his voice colder than before. "You two better prepare yourselves. This will not be swept under the rug. You've tarnished the reputation of the entire police force." Thompson opened his mouth to defend himself, but Taylor raised his hand to stop him. "I don't want to hear any excuses. We'll handle this matter seriously. Leave this area immediately." Miller and Thompson, now stripped of their pride, reluctantly exited the park under the scornful glares of the crowd. On the way to escort the elderly woman home, Mike reflected on what had just transpired. He understood that changing an entire system couldn't happen overnight, but today's small action had sparked a significant impact. Change begins with a single act of courage, a decision to stand against injustice. Shortly after Mike left the park, the incident began to circulate widely on social media, thanks to videos recorded by bystanders. Within hours, footage of the officer's abuse of power, alongside Mike Tyson's courageous stand for justice, became the center of public attention. The immense public pressure compelled the Riverdale Police Department to act swiftly. Lieutenant Taylor announced the immediate suspension of Miller and Thompson pending an investigation. An independent task force from the U.S. Justice Bureau was formed to scrutinize the officers' behavior and examine systemic flaws within the department. The investigative team quickly gathered evidence, including videos from witnesses, testimonies from Mike Tyson and Evelyn Thompson, and past complaints against Miller and Thompson. The footage clearly showed Evelyn sitting quietly on a bench, engaging in no suspicious activity, while the officers used unnecessary force, throwing her to the ground and handcuffing her roughly. Evelyn's testimony and Mike's account further solidified the case against the officers for abusing their power. The investigation also revealed a troubling history. Both Miller and Thompson had been the subjects of numerous complaints about misconduct, most of which had been dismissed or handled superficially. Outside the Riverdale Police Department, small protests erupted, with demonstrators holding signs demanding justice and police reform. Media outlets continuously reported on the incident, and Mike Tyson became a powerful voice representing the voiceless. In an interview, he shared, "Those without a voice deserve protection, not intimidation." Mike's words resonated deeply, fueling public outrage and prompting human rights organizations to step in, demanding transparency and accountability from the Riverdale Police Department. Miller and Thompson were summoned to an internal disciplinary hearing. Miller attempted to justify their actions, claiming they were simply doing their duty and acting quickly to ensure public safety. However, the video evidence from the scene utterly discredited his claims. The Internal Review Board highlighted that the officers had no concrete evidence linking Evelyn to any wrongdoing and had blatantly ignored fundamental verification procedures. Thompson sought forgiveness, pleading for leniency, but Lieutenant Taylor interrupted firmly. "Opportunities have been given time and time again, but you've destroyed the public's trust in this department." In the end, the Internal Review Board decided to terminate Miller and Thompson for abusing their power and committing severe ethical violations. Their records were forwarded to the Department of Justice for consideration of criminal charges related to the unlawful use of force and human rights violations. The verdict was widely publicized, and the Riverdale Police Department pledged to implement reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. When asked about the outcome, Mike Tyson remarked, "This is a step in the right direction. I hope it sends a strong message that the era of silence is over." The incident at the park and Mike Tyson's bold actions became a catalyst for systemic changes within law enforcement. Under intense public scrutiny and Lieutenant Taylor's commitment to reform, the Riverdale Police Department initiated a comprehensive renewal plan to restore community trust. Taylor announced that all officers would be required to undergo mandatory training on professional ethics, cultural sensitivity, and nonviolent crisis management. These sessions emphasized that the role of law enforcement is not to impose authority, but to protect and serve the community. A new complaint handling system was also introduced, allowing citizens to anonymously report abuses of power. All complaints would be thoroughly reviewed and independently investigated by an external committee to ensure transparency. Officers were encouraged to report their colleagues' misconduct without fear of retaliation. Although not part of the police force, Mike Tyson emerged as a strong advocate for these reform efforts. He frequently participated in neighborhood town halls, sharing his story and urging others to continue fighting for justice. During one such speech, he addressed the crowd, "Today, we witnessed something that should never happen, an abuse of power. An elderly woman, who did nothing wrong, was harassed and brutalized by those who were supposed to protect her. If we hadn't been there, would it have stopped? Would justice have been served?" The crowd responded with cheers. A man's voice rang out, "We see this all the time, but no one ever speaks up." Mike nodded, his determined gaze sweeping over the audience. "That's why I couldn't stay silent. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but it must be the last time we let it happen without action. I don't know this woman, but I know she didn't deserve to be treated like that. And I know it's our duty to stand up for what's right." The crowd erupted in applause. A young woman raised her phone high, shouting, "Mike Tyson isn't just a boxing legend. He's a hero of justice." Mike smiled but remained composed, knowing the path to change would be long. For him, fighting for justice was not the duty of one person but a collective mission for the entire community. Although Mike Tyson wasn't part of law enforcement, he became a passionate advocate for reform efforts. He regularly attended neighborhood town halls, sharing his story and urging people to continue the fight for justice. In a heartfelt speech before a crowd, Mike declared, "This isn't just the story of an elderly woman in a park. It's the story of all of us, of a system that needs to change. If we don't stand up, who will?" The crowd responded with thunderous applause. One person shouted, "We've seen this happen time and time again, but no one ever speaks out." Mike nodded, his eyes scanning the faces before him as he spoke with conviction. "That's why I couldn't stay silent. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but it must be the last time we allow it to continue without action. We all share the responsibility to stand up for what's right. Mike's actions that day didn't just change the life of one elderly woman. They ignited hope in thousands of others. He understood that real change begins with small steps, by refusing to turn away from injustice no matter where or to whom it happens. Each of us has a role to play in building a fairer community. Mike's presence at neighborhood town halls not only inspired but also drew media attention, keeping the focus on reform. He emphasized that meaningful change takes time and perseverance but can only be achieved if everyone works together. These efforts began to yield tangible results. Younger officers, especially new recruits, displayed a stronger commitment to fostering relationships with the community. Numerous programs promoting interaction between law enforcement and residents were launched, helping both sides understand each other and break down stereotypes. Officers attended meetings at schools, churches, and neighborhoods to hear citizens' concerns and feedback. Evelyn Thompson, the elderly woman who had been a victim in the park incident, became a symbol of the fight for justice. She joined Mike Tyson at community meetings, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak out against injustice. The story of Mike Tyson and Evelyn spread beyond the city where it occurred, gaining nationwide attention. It became a symbol of solidarity, proving that one individual can spark significant change by standing against wrongdoing. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForEvelyn and #StandWithMike became movements, encouraging people to share their experiences of confronting injustice and fighting for what's right. Mike continued his leadership in the reform movement, advocating not only for systemic changes in law enforcement, but also for educational and community programs that teach young people the value of fairness and respect. Evelyn, now fully recovered both physically and emotionally, lives a peaceful life, surrounded by a community that protects and respects her. She often says, "That day, I thought I wouldn't live to see another. But Mike stood up, and because of him, I've regained my faith in humanity and justice." The story of Mike Tyson and Evelyn is a powerful testament to the strength of courage and unity. It shows that no matter how challenging the circumstances, justice can prevail when someone is willing to stand up for what's right. Systemic change doesn't happen overnight, but with every action and every voice, a fairer society can be built. Looking back, Mike doesn't take pride in his fame or achievements. What satisfies him most is knowing that he didn't turn away when faced with injustice, that he did the right thing, and that his small act brought hope to many. Smiling, he continues his journey for justice, knowing this is only the beginning. This story reminds us that even a small action can spark significant change, especially when you stand up for what's right. Have you ever faced an injustice and had to decide whether to act? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your voice could inspire others and help spread positivity. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and family to spread the message of courage, justice, and unity. Thank you for watching and supporting. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this. Together, we can create a community where kindness, fairness, and respect are at the forefront. Wishing you peace and happiness always.